Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Turn the Page to 2025, Mastering Storytelling in L&D this year, presented by Litmos. Thank you so much for taking the time today from everywhere around the world. We're really pleased that you were able to join us today. While we're just getting started and letting people trickle in, feel free to use the chat box to your right to tell us where you're logging in from. And while we're waiting, I'll just share a few tips about this webinar platform to help you get the most out of today's presentation. So before we get the conversation going, here are a few housekeeping notes. In your webinar console, you'll notice there's a chat box to the right of the slide deck area. So throughout the presentation, you can use that chat box to discuss the topic being discussed. You can also scroll down and use that Q&A box where you can type your questions to our team during the presentation. And we'll do our best to try to answer those in real time. We encourage you to only send questions in the Q&A window if possible, just because it's easier for us to actually sort the Q&As in that box versus in the chat. We'll also be saving a few of your questions for the end of the presentation for John to discuss during our Q&A portion. And just a reminder that this is being recorded and will be sent to you via email with the email that you registered with, so keep an eye on your inboxes. And now, without further ado, I will hand it over to the man of the hour, Litmos's Director of Learning, John Hill.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Really appreciate it. Good morning and good afternoon for those of you who are not in the UK, as I am. And if you haven't dealt with me before, then you can probably tell from my accent, I'm based in the UK here in Stourbridge in the West Midlands. And it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon here, but I appreciate some of you are joining early in the day, so I really, really appreciate that. This is a rerun of a session I ran last year at DevLearn. And so in the spirit of storytelling, it's kind of an adapted screenplay. This was a stage play, now it's a screenplay. So we're going to do some activities today that we'll probably play a little bit differently online than they did in the room, but I'm still hoping you're going to get a lot out of that. So without further ado, let's get started. So this quote here isn't to flatter you, but looking at some of the names in the list here, I can see there's some big brains on this webinar today. And although I am going to flatter you by saying you've all got big brains, we need to realise that humans, we have massive brains. They're very complex machines, and it's probably the most complex object in the known universe. And the really kind of paradoxical thing about this is that it's a very simple way to hack it. And it's something we've evolved over time, is that the oldest hack to engage the brain is storytelling, because our brains crave patterns. And although that can lead to kind of bias and preconceptions, misconceptions, it also powers things like intuition and imagination. And these mechanisms respond really, really powerfully to storytelling. So despite its complexity, there's a very simple way to engage your attention, to engage your recall, to engage your memory. And that's storytelling, because stories are sticky. So instructional design owes a lot to storytelling. And you can probably remember from growing up and your school life, some of the best teachers were also great storytellers. So in the spirit of storytelling, we're going to start with that kind of oldest opening of all time, the Once Upon a Time. So I'd like you to all think about your first compliance training, perhaps in a workplace environment, perhaps your first job. And we're going to open a poll in a moment for you to kind of give some feedback on that. So was it effective? Was it engaging? Was it boring? Why was it? So we'll open a poll in a moment and have sort of about 30, 40 seconds to get your thoughts on that. So you'll see the options here. We've got boring, engaging, effective, or other to share in the chat window. And if you've been doing this as long as I have, that first compliance training may be a long time ago, once upon a time. Just taking a look at what's coming through on the chat as well.
It's looking like 77% of people are saying boring. 13% are saying effective, and 8% are saying engaging, And then 2% say others share in the chat window. So if anybody has anything in the chat they want to share about their compliance experience, feel free.
That's great. Okay, so that's quite a strong answer for boring, and we'll get into perhaps how we can avoid that in future for you. Some of the comments here: boring and effective, because the two things aren't mutually exclusive, unfortunately. You know, sometimes it can be both. Shall we close the poll down now and see what the final? There we go. Cool. Okay, so yeah, that surprised me a little bit different to when I ran it in the room in Las Vegas, but that's quite funny. So what I'm going to propose to you today is kind of like this immersive learning that we need to get people into to kind of circumvent that kind of expectation around compliance training being boring, is where storytelling is going to take us. So my kind of first hot take for you today is that immersive learning doesn't require any fancy technology. You don't need to be mailing VR headsets out to your staff to immerse them in training. We can immerse people in storytelling because we experience stories, we lose ourselves in stories, we experience them, and we invest and we commit, and we like to see what happens next. You know, if you're a fan of a particular TV series, like at the moment on Silo and Severance, and you just want to see what happens next, you're invested in the story, invested in what happens next. We don't just process stories, we experience them at some level. So I'm going to kind of have another hot take here, that I'm going to suggest that the first bit of compliance training you ever took was in fact nursery stories and nursery rhymes and fairy tales. And here are 3 examples. Hansel and Gretel was a cautionary tale about food safety and stranger danger. Little Red Riding Hood was an early lesson in identity verification and the importance of sticking to approved communication channels. And Rumpelstiltskin was a stark warning about the dangers of entering into contracts without fully understanding the terms. And these fairy tales are not just entertainment; they kind of wrap important lessons in unforgettable narratives, and they kind of stick with you for life. And that's not just magic. That's not just fairy tales. That's not pixie dust. That's good storytelling. And this is where storytelling kind of fits in with other theories like schemas and dual coding and what they call the von Restorff effect, to make things kind of stand out, and you recall them more powerfully and you make associations with your existing knowledge and your new knowledge. So this is my pitch to you today, is that the original compliance training was fairy tales. And there are historical reasons behind stories like fairy tales as to why those tales were told. They're often morality tales that kind of wrap up a lesson in a narrative to teach children the difference between right and wrong. So they're not just fairy stories. There are clear moral lessons in stories like Little Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel. And that can be aligned with, in the workplace, compliance objectives. And then there's also this idea of kind of natural justice, the bad guy getting their comeuppance in the end, with rules and regulations, and those consequences of the actions, and the importance of following procedures, and ultimately this kind of very powerful cultural transmission. You know, we all remember these stories. They're kind of pretty universal. They're cross-cultural, and I think most HR directors and most L&D directors would kind of kill for that transmissibility, memorability, and engagement that this very kind of primal level of storytelling achieves in a business organization. So I think there's something we can tap into here in terms of the shape of these stories and how they work in order to make these experiences a little less boring, more effective. So this aligns with, some of you may have heard this before, the kind of hero's journey. So commonly in a fairy tale, you're introduced to a character, you find out what their life was like before, and then a problem emerges, and then they have obstacles to overcome, and then they have a moral lesson at the end of it. And that aligns very kind of clearly with Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And that's a book which was published in the 40s, about the hero with many faces, how most stories in Western culture in particular follow a similar sort of trajectory. And they're broadly 3 stages to this, although I think there's 13 or 17 steps in Joseph Campbell's final work, but they broadly fall into separation, initiation, and return. So characters in a fairy tale are kind of separated from their everyday life. They're initiated into a new world where they have to overcome new problems, and then they return to their old life changed, often better than they were before. And again, another hot take for you today. This aligns also very powerfully and very clearly with a lot of the common instructional design models out there. So you can see how it aligns with Dr. Michael Allen's context challenge activity feedback model. And some of you who've read Julie Dirkson's work will be familiar with that. So the idea that you provide context, a challenge, there's an activity that deals with that challenge, and then you get feedback, you come out of the situation changed. And then there's the Kuhlman 3C model, Tom Kuhlman's challenge, choice, consequences, which is, again, is a kind of simplified but analogous version of separation, initiation, return, where you provide a challenge, you give choices, and you show consequences. And then if you get into the nitty-gritty of how the kind of character interactions work with this, I recommend you pick up Franz Green's instructional story design, where he breaks this down into introducing characters and the conflict between characters, and then a desire for resolution, and then the training and the action that's required from that. But again, you can see it aligns with this, and ultimately all lines and stacks up against Merrill's principles of instruction about activation, demonstration, application, and integration of knowledge. So this hero's journey is kind of the same shape you'll see through a lot of these models. And if you do nothing else today, but come out of this session thinking about the shape of your story and this simplified version of these models, you're going to improve your learning experiences for your trainees. So anyone in from Indianapolis? Again, I asked this in Las Vegas and there's nobody in, unfortunately, from Indianapolis, but Indianapolis is the hometown of one of my favorite writers, a guy called Kurt Vonnegut. You may have heard the name, you may be familiar with the name, and you may hopefully even be familiar with some of his work. He was a writer who lived through World War II, and one of his most famous works, Slaughterhouse 5, directly addresses his experiences in World War II and the sort of carpet bombing of Dresden, among other places. And he was a very clever man, and he had a very good knack at simplifying very complex ideas. And he wrote 14 novels in his lifetime. He died in 2007, and I recommend that at the very least you check out Slaughterhouse 5 or maybe Breakfast of Champions to get a flavour for his work. But one of the pieces of work that he's kind of less famous for is his model of the shape of stories, which, if you have a quick Google on this, Vonnegut shape of stories, you'll find a lot of information on this. It was part of a dissertation he wrote when he was demobbed from the army under the GI Bill. He went to University of Chicago and attempted to put in a thesis around this, but they rejected it as kind of too silly and too simple. But it's been recognised in the years since as being a really powerful model. And the man in the hole model is this idea that the main character gets into trouble, then he gets out of trouble, and then it ends up better for the experience. And if I can't see any more powerful allegory, any more powerful comparison with compliance training, it's that. You know, in a workplace, someone gets into trouble, they haven't done something they need to do, they need to know how to get out of trouble and end up better from the experience. And ultimately, we want to kind of leave people better off for our learning experiences, but also empower them in a way that means that if they do get into that hole, they can get out of the hole. So I'm going to play a short video now where Kurt himself is going to explain how this works.
Has created a body of work of startling eccentricity and universal appeal. His singular view of the world applies not just to his stories and characters, but to some of his theories as well.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really, is the shape of the curves of what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average. Is why get a depressing person? We'll start the whole thing. We call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I've said it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories about below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See? Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her a means of transportation. Goes to the party. Dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now, there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes, the shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
Okay, so in the words of Vonnegut himself, we're looking at a shape of a story here where the protagonist ends up better than when they began, but the challenges they have to overcome to get there are really what's important. And hold on to another thing that he mentioned there as well about how much we relate to a character. Do we like people who are kind of in a below average situation? Do we root for an underdog? Think about how the character helps you engage with the story. And we're going to look over the course of the next half an hour as to the kind of voice we use when we're dealing with characters in order to engage with them. But ultimately to put them through this arc, this kind of shape of the story, this man in the hole that Kurt Vonnegut himself describes. So here we go. Hansel has moved through the curve. He's ended up in a higher position than he started. He's gone through the separation, initiation, return. He's gone through the context, challenge, activity, and the feedback. And he's come out the other side in a better position. And that's what we're driving for. And that's what we're striving for with our compliance training in particular. So this shape can be a literal graph. It can represent a drop in a share price. It can drop in customer satisfaction scores or compliance scores. So what's caused this pitfall? What's the hole? What's the shape of the hole? Why are you in the hole? What's caused that? But we can also flip it. So I'll call this Hill's man on a ledge. Kurt Vonnegut's man in a hole. This is Hill's man on a ledge. You know, it could be an increase in accidents or factory emissions or complaints. But in both instances, they're going to be in a better position than they were after the experience than when they started. So in this graph, you'll see actually the finish point is lower than the start because we want a decrease in something. So this can work in both directions. You can use it to increase customer satisfaction and decrease complaints. But you're ultimately looking at this kind of three-part arc and how you get the character through that, how you get the learner through that, and equip them to kind of deal with that situation when it arises. And there's a very canny way of doing this. You don't necessarily need to show everything preceding that kind of life before in the fairy tale. You'll recall some of these fairy tales, the details of the characters' lives are kind of sketched out. You only know what you absolutely need to know about the characters before they have the problem. And in script writing and screenwriting terms, this is techniques known as start late, leave early. Can you think of any examples? Just pop in the chat where you kind of dropped into the story. There's a particular British guy whose film's always open with this technique. See if anyone can just pop his name in the chat there. And you don't know how he got there. You just know through the experience from what you're seeing that this is a kind of competent guy who kind of can handle himself in a dangerous situation, and he gets himself out of the situation. And then ultimately, just before the kind of opening credits roll, he introduces himself as Bond, James Bond, and you leave early. And it's the idea that you don't need to fill everything out on either side of this arc to create a really powerful learning experience. And this application's in the workplace because we're in time-pressed environments where our learners don't necessarily have all day to go through a novel. We're looking at something that's very much more episodic, and this has parallels with micro-learning. Start late, leave early. And of course, if you leave early, you're not resolving the problem for the learner. You're putting them in a position to answer the questions and resolve the problem and be trained rather than just watch somebody else resolve the problem. So I'm going to play a video now where that's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to start late and leave early.
The moment Sarah opened the email, she knew something was wrong. Customer data sprawled across her screen. A lump formed in her throat. How did this happen? What should she do now?
Okay, so how do we feel about Sarah? How do we feel about Sarah and her predicament? Pop some observations in the chat. Do we like Sarah? Are we afraid for Sarah? Are we kind of relishing not being in that situation ourselves? Is there a bit of schadenfreude there? Are we enjoying watching her struggle? How do we feel? Anxious for her? That's a really good, relatable empathy, concern. I'm stressed for Sarah. So really, really, yeah. So you can see how we don't necessarily need to know what Sarah did that morning, what she had for breakfast. We started late and we're leaving early because we don't know how this is going to resolve. So that creates a bit of tension. But again, if you imagine that graph in the background where all the best compliance training should do this, it kind of drops you into this situation, creates this stress and empathy, and so encourages you to help to put them out of that situation. And what we're doing there as well is we're also using what's called the third person limited perspective, where we're kind of relaying Sarah's thoughts with this kind of powerful, sort of slightly ominous voiceover as well. And we're going to get into that as well over the next 20 minutes in terms of how the perspective can change how you interact and feel about the characters in these situations. But ultimately, we don't know how she got into this situation, and we don't know how she's going to get out of this situation. And this provides the impetus in a training situation for you to then introduce activities and questions to help get that person out the other side and complete Vonnegut's curve. So if Sarah was, really, really competent and didn't get into that situation, we probably wouldn't relate to her very well. And there's such a thing as the pratfall effect in training. Look this up. The pratfall effect's really interesting. It's based on a study which involved a radio quiz with 3 contestants. They were complete stooges, and the audience were asked to kind of rate how much they liked the contestants. And one was rubbish and didn't do very well, didn't answer the questions very well. Another was extremely competent and was high scoring and was clearly going to be the winner. And then there was someone in between who was very competent, very knowledgeable, but during the presentation, during the quiz, spilt their drink and just felt a bit more likable, a bit more human. And that's the pratfall effect. We relate better to people who we perceive as being like us and being sort of more human and not perfect, like Peter Perfect. So a perfect character, Sarah is not a perfect character, but someone like Jane, who always follows every rule and never makes mistakes. We all worked with Jane, haven't we? But if we kind of just tweak that a bit, Jane, like many of us, sometimes struggles to keep up with new regulation, but is committed to improving. So just by kind of rounding that character out, and again, we don't need to know everything about Jane, but that's enough information about Jane for us to kind of relate to her more powerfully. And it makes her kind of more human and more like us. So the pratfall effect's really powerful. Another example here is Bob. We've all worked with Bob, haven't we? Bob immediately recognises and reports every potential compliance issue. Yeah, I'm sure you do, Bob. But in reality, probably truth be told, Bob, initially misses some red flags, but he learns to identify them through experience and training. And again, that feels more like us. So as Liz has just said in the chat here, which one do you relate most to, which imperfect character? And I think a lot of those great heroes are quite imperfect. Tony Stark is kind of arrogant but really, really clever, and sometimes his arrogance is his downfall, and he has to kind of work around his arrogance to kind of step back from himself a bit to kind of come back as the hero. Most characters have some sort of flaw. Most relatable characters have some sort of flaw that kind of makes you warm to them more. Each character in Ted Lasso, exactly. Yeah, that is a brilliant example of the kind of pratfall effect. Some really, really good character examinations in that series. Yeah, there's a really good suggestion, Dawn. Yeah, but again, you wouldn't feel as kind of warm towards those characters if they're all perfect and logical. Even Mr. Spock in Star Trek, he's this Vulcan who's logical, but his flaw is actually he's a little bit human, and he kind of sometimes doesn't behave in the way that they expect these logical Vulcans to behave, and you kind of warm to him more as a result. So here's an example of exactly that. This video shows a character describing their struggles in dealing with the interview process because of their neurodiversity. And it's from our recent suite of neurodiversity courses. I just want you to pay attention to what this character is saying and just think about how you feel towards this character. Maybe just throw some comments up in the chat as you go.
Hi, I'm Rosalina. I've been looking for a job for months and finally had my first phone call with a job I applied for recently. I'm autistic, and I didn't know this until I turned 22 and got a diagnosis. I've had the odd job here or there, but never one that lasted longer than a year. I just finished my degree, and I'm smart. It's just that I get nervous during interviews, making it difficult to speak about my skills confidently. In-person interviews have never been one of my strong points. However, over the years, I've adapted by masking to be normal during them. I have excellent skills like being creative and being a problem solver, but most of the time, I can't portray them due to my nerves and lack of understanding of social cues.
Okay, everybody, how do you feel about Rosalina? How do you feel about her situation? What have you learned about her, and what does it make you think about her? Put some comments in the chat if you can. Does anyone see themselves in Rosalina? Can you relate to that compassion from Kelly there? Empathy, a bit of familiarity there as well. I have empathy for her. She's approachable and self-aware. Okay, that's good. So coming in thick and fast now, empathise with the situation. I want to help her to succeed. That's a really great observation, Mallory. And as you see in the background there, what I've done there is I've intercut the two parts of the course. We've got the little video which introduces you to her situation, and she talks in that first person. Although this is what we call third person limited still. We're still kind of kind of viewing this person from a distance. And in the background there, you will have seen some activities where you need to make accommodations and make some decisions to make that interview process as positive an experience for Rosalina, given her neurodiversity. And again, we're coming back to Vonnegut's arc. We're trying to get people out the other side of that hole, get them out of the hole and through the other side. So we're leaving early. We're not showing the interview situation. We're putting the learner in a situation where they help Rosalina. But because we've made that character relatable, because we've used that pratfall effect and we've shone a light on the imperfections and what makes her human, we're relating to her, and it's all very much in the context of that situation. And this is where we link kind of tacit and explicit knowledge, where we explicitly know how to do something, and tacitly we kind of know how stories can kind of mesh those two together and really make connections that weren't there before. Thank you. So these perspectives we started to see here can be summarized as follows. You have the first person perspective. So commonly, first person perspective, if you were reading a book, someone would be talking about themselves as I, and you'd be seeing the world through their eyes. Now, this isn't something we tend to do so much in e-learning. Again, coming back to my comments at the top of the webinar about we're not going to send VR headsets out to everybody. But there are ways, and I'll show some techniques, where you can put a learner in that first person perspective, where they become I. But I understand and appreciate why that's not something that we commonly use in e-learning. We tend to use this slightly more authoritative second person perspective, where we say, you do this. So again, we can put the learner in the middle of the action, but there's a bit of detachment. There's almost kind of like this God in the machine, this voice that says, you do this. And then taking that a step further away, we have the third person limited, which we saw in the example with the Sarah and the email situation. We're saying, these are her thoughts. We could get in a kind of window into that person's head, exactly as per the illustration here. But again, it's kind of detached. We're kind of pointing that out. And then if we were to kind of pan left on that scene and show what Bob was doing at his desk, perfect Bob, who never clicks on something in an email that he shouldn't, and hear his thoughts, again, that's another example of third person omniscience, where we're kind of moving then between different characters and kind of moving through a situation and almost being able to kind of tune in like a radio to what they're thinking. But these can be tricky to apply, and even though Rosalina's talking in the first person, she's referring to herself as I. That's an example of what we call kind of like third person limited. And you can use these perspectives sort of in concert with each other as well. And of course, then once that video is finished and you've finished listening to Rosalina, you switch into that second person perspective and what would you do to help her situation, make her interview situation more pleasant and accommodate her needs. So in the handout section, and if you scan this QR code, you'll find a worksheet. And again, because we're not all in a room together and I can't kind of circulate and talk to you all about what you're thinking on this, please use the chat in order to give me some feedback on this. But let's have a think about those different perspectives, that kind of first, second, and those two varieties of third person perspective, that kind of limited omniscient perspective. What do you think the tone of voice is for each perspective? And how would you frame a story using those perspectives? And what are the advantages or disadvantages? So you might want to focus in on the one that you commonly use at the moment, or maybe think about, okay, I commonly write in second person. What would happen if I shifted this into a first person experience, or used a more kind of detached kind of third person and sort of documentary kind of style, where I can flit around a situation and show different perspectives. And Lucy's raised a very good question there. We're probably covering the Q&A as well. But yeah, how do we what's the line between making something authentic and a made-up story when writing from perspective? Again, we need to link everything we're doing in a story to a purpose, to the context, and to make sure that it's plausible. So working with SMEs to kind of have a plausible situation. What's this? Is the shape of this hole plausible? Is this issue, the man in the hole, a plausible real life event? Is it based on anything that's actually happened in the business? For instance, we have a lot of data in our businesses where we can find these pitfalls, find where people have fallen short, find where there's been errors and unforced errors and failures of procedure and process, and they can give you the shape. We just then need to make sure that that's relatable through the character's experience. So a first person perspective, you're kind of in the hole. You don't know how you got there necessarily. You need help getting out of it. Second person perspective might kind of step you back a little bit and say, look, there's the hole and the person's in it. What are you going to do to help them? And again, this kind of third person limited and third person omniscient takes it even further back. You know, you're kind of standing like a journalist, sort of several feet away behind a police tape saying, look what's happened over there. And those different perspectives can give you different levels of emotional connection, different levels of contextual connection with the content. Okay, let's move on to the next point. So here is a video from the Litmos content library. This is for a new suite of courses, and you will see from this how we've used a kind of first person experience. We're going to place the learner actually in the situation and almost kind of have them assume the role of an employee at a company and have to directly interact with the course in order to solve that problem, to get out of the hole.
Hi there. Thanks for joining us. This course covers a topic related to Employee Experience Management, or EXM. You can take this training as a standalone module, but it's a bit like eating a single potato chip. That's because this course was designed as part of a much wider series about EXM. You can enjoy a single chip, but it's best consumed with others. In the EXM series, you'll find 20 topics on key areas of the employee journey. You can access the courses individually, like this one, or through 5 stages of the employee lifecycle: recruitment, onboarding, development, retention, and exit. Each stage contains 4 topics. The EXM series takes place in the shared working space of CoLab Co, a professional but fictional co-working community. Each course is designed to immerse you in the world of CoLab Co and its characters, and put you at the center of the action. Catch up on the company newsletter, People Power, or stay in the loop with the latest EXM updates scrolling social media. You could also engage with colleagues in a productive squads meeting, or take a ride in the elevator to explore the floors of CoLab Co and test your knowledge. However you take this training, we hope you enjoy the experience.
This end-of-course assessment is presented as a first-person chat with colleagues. The learner needs to choose the most appropriate responses to solve the problem at hand. Success is indicated by heart reactions. But if the learner is unsure, they can seek help from a friendly colleague. Feedback and support is provided directly to the learner, as if they are having a conversation. This style of interaction reflects the reality of the modern remote workplace. The interface is intended to feel familiar in a way that makes it easy to use, allowing the learner to become part of the story. So, how did we do?
Remote working is a vital part of ours and many organizations, so we need to do a lot more to create the best employee experiences for valuable and valued team members like James. He's already working overtime doing his best for his family without our poor management and lack of empathy causing him problems. We are so impressed with what you've done here. You've uncovered what was going wrong, and then gone the extra mile to explain it all so we can see how things need to change. We can also see how those changes will benefit us and the work we do, and how it will benefit our remote employees.
So there's an example of that first person perspective, very literally putting the learner in a situation where they need to resolve the problem. They are part of the furniture. They are dropped into the offices of CoLab Co and are dealing and interacting with other members of staff. They're addressing that learner by name. And when you view that course on the Litmos platform, it will include the learner's name. So it will say, Jonathan, what do I do next? So it's a really, really powerful way to engage. And again, that gives you the ability to put someone in the hole in Vonnegut's curve, and they're looking up to try and get out, and they need to find the best way to get out of that. So that's obviously one way of tackling a compliance training situation. Here is an example of second person perspective. But again, we've got a kind of first person view, but you'll notice that the tone of this course is in the second person. It's being addressed in that slightly more detached second person, more traditional tone of voice that we use in e-learning. And this is from a series of courses on the Ontarians with Disability Act in Canada.
It's a gorgeous day in Ontario. The sun is shining, birds are singing, and there's the smell of coffee in the air. You take a seat at the local cafe and look at the menu.
Can I take your order?
Were you able to access and understand the menu easily? Now imagine that this was your experience.
Can I take your order?
How did that feel? Did you struggle to read? For some people, they receive information like this.
Can I take your order?
And this?
Can I take your order?
And this?
Can I take your order?
Did the amount of text feel overwhelming? Did you miss the service queue? For many people in Ontario, this is a daily experience. They continually face barriers that prevent them from accessing the same goods, services, and facilities as those who do not have a disability.
So there we can see how the second person perspective is being used to great effect to provide a series of simulations, kind of situations, and shift between them, and hopefully help the learner make emotional connections, develop empathy to kind of see themselves in different situations, but they're being addressed as you. It's kind of a second person experience in that regard, in terms of the tone that the course is taking. But you can see how these perspectives can be blurred and kind of work in concert with each other. Finally, I have an example here of the more kind of documentary style kind of third person perspective. And this is from our suite of courses on neurodiversity, which again is a new suite of courses which were released last year.
Neurodivergent conditions were once thought of as solely pathological and often have negative connotations. In other words, there's something wrong or abnormal which needs to be treated or fixed. Neurodiversity still acknowledges the conditions, yet suggests that there is no normal or right type of brain. Each person has their own strengths and weaknesses to be catered for. Unfortunately, the systems and processes in our society, for the most part, aren't designed for those who are neurodivergent. This is similar to the social model of disability. The social model of disability sees disability as a social construct rather than a medical one. It argues that social barriers are what disable people. For example, a person in a wheelchair cannot get into a building because there are no ramps, only stairs. So the building has caused a problem by stopping the person from entering it. The social model of disability has been particularly important with the autism rights movements. It encourages us to realize that these barriers can make it harder for neurodivergent people. If we can remove these barriers, people with a neurodiversity have more choice, control, and independence over their own lives. Neurodiversity is about championing differences, maximizing their strengths, and adjusting for their challenges, and ultimately understanding that we are all different.
So there we go. That's an example of that very much more detached, but still friendly documentary style third person perspective, which just gives the narrator the ability to kind of pull in information from outside the course, to make reference to other items, and to describe what's going on in that more kind of overview way. So these are all examples of courses that are found in the Litmos content library. We have 4,500 courses covering healthcare, compliance, soft skills, and they're available as part of the Litmos package, but also available as standalone courses to put on your own platforms as well. So if you're interested, please drop us a line if you're interested in these courses. But there are really powerful examples, I feel, of the different uses of perspective and the storytelling and relatable characters, and this kind of idea that we've got to get the person out of the hole. Compliance training, you need to put people in a better position than they were before, to kind of quote Vonnegut, and give them kind of good fortune. So ultimately, will we all live happily ever after? Can we kind of wave a magic wand and make all training like this overnight? Maybe, maybe not. And we'll address that in the Q&A. But hopefully what I've given you today is a few kind of key tips to just make some very kind of fundamental changes to your compliance training, to think about it in a more three-part structure way that allows you to put somebody through this experience and have them better off as a result of the experience. So after you've sort of had a cup of coffee, walked the dog, had to think about what we talked about today, I'd like you to perhaps think about a situation like insider training and how we might commonly perhaps do that from a second person perspective. What might we gain from doing it in a first person perspective or third person perspective? I think about the pros and cons of each approach and how you'd incorporate that kind of man in the hole structure and perhaps elements of start late and leave early alongside relatable characters to create an engaging narrative and a memorable lesson. Those are the kind of big takeaways today, that three-part structure, start late, leave early, and those engaging characters are kind of human and relatable. And you want to get them out of the hole. That's the point. So finally, just got a few words of advice. Those of you old enough to remember Blockbuster Video, you go into the video shop and you'd perhaps pick up a video based on the cover, then you'd look at the back and go, do I really want to rent this video? How's it selling it to me? Like the blurb on the back of a book, like in the blurb on the back of a Vonnegut book, for instance. What is it about that story, about that content that's going to grab you? So we would recommend, the content team would recommend that in terms of what metadata you attach to courses, short course descriptions would be somewhere between 80 to 100 words with about 600 characters with spaces in order for your platform to to search on that and retrieve that efficiently for your learner. And once they're sat reading this, clearly there's insider trading blurb here. Is it arresting? Does it grab them? Does it make them want to kind of turn the page? Does it want to make them pick up that book, rent that video? And then again, a little bit like on Amazon, in terms of what do you see when you first see that result in a search engine? The kind of very kind of short description here. Do you summarize it in a way that's making people kind of sit up, make them kind of rent the video, turn the page, take it home? And again, we're looking at about 35 words and 250 characters there for most search engines and most platforms to kind of grab that content in a way that is relevant, but also then written in a way that makes people want to click start. So the next chapter for you all is to concentrate on how narrative enhances and supports learning. Focus on simple story structures because they're versatile tools. You can have a very simple story structure, but very versatile outputs. You want to place relatable characters into relevant situations and be aware how the perspective you're taking shapes the context. And don't give away the ending. Start late, leave early. Learners need to finish the story. And commonly we're, perhaps got an SME who wants everything to be included in the course, for instance. Don't give away the ending. The ending needs to be written by the learner. We haven't talked about branching scenarios in any length today, but the idea that you're kind of finishing the story and that the learner's decisions and actions influence the story is a really, really powerful way to use these techniques in order to make things stick, because stories are sticky. So that just brings us to the end of today's prepared slides and materials. And if you've got any questions at all about, sorry. Yeah, Mom. Yeah, I'm doing a webinar, doing it now. Yeah, now. Yeah, I got it there. Can't talk. Yeah, I'll give you a call after I've finished. Okay. Love you too. Bye. Were any of you waiting for the phone to ring while you were watching the presentation today? Did you see it on the shelf in the background? My final piece of advice to you all is a maxim called Chekhov's gun. Now, we talked about storytelling and being ambitious with storytelling and using these techniques to really kind of grab people and make them kind of sit up and notice what's going on. But don't be tempted to put loads of stuff in that is distracting. Always have something there for a purpose. Don't put a telephone on the shelf unless it's going to ring. So when you're building learning experiences, concentrate on making everything related to the learning outcomes. And I've been doing this long enough to know that in the past, perhaps get a bit carried away with some of these techniques, and you can increase cognitive load. You can introduce elements that are not relevant. Chekhov's gun. If there's a gun on stage on Act 1, it's going to go off in Act 3. If there's a telephone in the background of a presentation, it's going to go off by the end of the presentation. And that's my final bit of advice to you all today, is don't get carried away with this, but use it in a very kind of structured and strategic way. But any questions beyond that, please pop them in the chat. I'm happy to go through them there.
And I'm just going to pop on and we can go through the Q&A, because we do have a few different questions. I was really surprised by the phone. Wow. The Chekhov's phone. I love it. Well, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, there were some questions about, what it takes to kind of build the compliance training that you showed examples of. So Don and Jeff both asked about the timeline for creating something as whether it's first, second, or third person, something as like interactive and engaging as what you've created. How long would you say it takes, and what does it take to create that kind of training?
That's a really great question, and I can't claim to stand here in front of everybody and say that I made this. These are produced by the Litmos content team, who are a very talented group of instructional designers and digital designers who together go through a storyboarding and build process, which results in courses like this. These are courses that are probably more toward what we call our kind of bespoke, or if you went by t-shirt sizes, a large size. There's more kind of effort gone into this, because we've had to kind of marry, particularly for neurodiversity, as you've seen, there's character animations and the like. But don't let that put you off. I mean, these are produced commonly in kind of 12-week sprints, and we release bigger courses every quarter. If you're e-learning department of one, you can achieve similar storytelling results with fewer resources. Don't let this kind of intimidate you. I've seen some very good storytelling used in training courses which are delivered as text via email. I've seen MailChimp used as a delivery method for this, where a series of emails emerge in your inbox over the course of a week, and there's a story in there that engages you in what to do next. So this immersion that you're trying to achieve, you can achieve it in a very much more polished way with a bigger team, but there's lots of elements out there, lots of tools you can use to move towards this. Lots of rapid authoring tools, for instance, where in the animation realm, things like Beyond, where you can do kind of off-the-shelf animations of characters. That's the way you want to take it, but always kind of just linking it back to what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes what you're trying to achieve is achievable in a storyboard and with just a basic set of interactions, but where you're looking for that kind of engagement and realism, yes, you might need to get more resources involved. But there's lots of kind of Creative Commons content out there as well for those of you at e-learning teams of one, free videos and animations and widgets that you can drop into your courses. So I recommend you kind of have a look around for that, shop around, but it all begins on the page with the storyboard.
Yeah, I think this lends itself nicely to the next set of questions that we've gotten from Jeff and Wendy about using generative AI, or how AI can support the building of these assets, these courses.
That is a good question as well. I think when you're writing in a certain point of view or from a certain perspective, particularly SMEs, the SME's been doing this job for 25 years. They don't make mistakes. They can't imagine what it'd be like to make a mistake. They don't really see themselves in that situation. As long as you've got the shape of that story, there are uses for AI to say, look, well, here's the process, here's the procedure, here's the common pain points. I'd like you to imagine you were a new member of staff and describe how you would feel in these situations if these errors emerged. imagine you're in the 4th week of your induction and you've just been dropped into this situation and you've only got a fact sheet to help you get through this customer interaction. How would you feel? What might happen? And use the kind of AI as another SME who can perhaps step outside themselves a little bit and imagine themselves in a different situation. And it can sometimes be helpful if you're getting more advanced in terms of branching situations to kind of figure out the logic for that as well, to figure out where the kind of fatal decisions are in your process if you're going to go down that route. But I think one of the best and most powerful uses is imagine you're a new starter in this job, define what the job is, how do you feel in this situation, what would happen next, and just get them to kind of verbalize that for you in a way that you perhaps wouldn't necessarily be able to do yourself. Because again, storytelling, there's elements of realism come from how the characters speak and how they interact, and sometimes just using AI to get a different view on things can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I think there's another question that's related to AI about AI within authoring tools. I think that kind of lends itself to what you're saying, using it to get different perspectives.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question now from Tom about how Litmos determines what courses to make next.
Well, our product managers are primarily responsible for that in the content team. Unfortunately, they're not on the call today, but they're each responsible for different areas of our course library, and they will be kind of looking at changes in those sectors to make sure we're up to date, but also looking for things that are coming in, commonly new legislation, new trends, new technologies, in order to kind of prioritize what comes next. So in short, that's how we do it. We try to take a kind of retroactive view to make sure we're keeping everything up to date, but a more proactive view to see what's coming based on those common areas that we work in, and they're typically soft skills, compliance, and healthcare.
Great. Another one was about how you made the phone ring.
This is a little fob. The phone is designed for stage plays, and you press on or off to make it stop or start. So if you were holding a play and you wanted somebody on stage to answer the phone, you can time it with this. The TSA staff at Vegas Airport loved this, and they spent about 10 minutes just playing with it when they checked my carry-on luggage. I was a bit concerned for a while, but it was very quickly apparent that they just thought it was hilarious, and they let me on the plane to go home. So
yes, playing with it, it's like, oh, am I in trouble? A question that I had, actually, what British director were you talking about when you said the director known for dropping it in the middle and ending early? There were a couple different guesses in the chat. So
well, I wasn't focusing on director such. I was focusing on the character of James Bond, but Christopher Nolan is a great example of that. Christopher Nolan does not hang about for you. If you weren't paying attention, you might have to rewind, and that's a danger, I think, sometimes if you're a little bit too ambitious with the start late, leave early technique. I still don't understand Tenet. I'm a massive fan of Christopher Nolan, but that film still leaves me a little bit confused, and that's what you don't want. You don't kind of overwhelm users.
He might have had too many Chekhov's guns in there, perhaps.
Totally, but you'll see this when you see a TV show, a film. If the camera lingers on an object, there's probably a reason why, and you can't unsee this as well. So consider how frustrated you'd be if the camera lingered on an object unnecessarily, and you kind of you pay more attention to that object than the actual dialogue or the story. Yeah. So there's a balance to be struck there as well.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the hour. I want to thank you so much for your time today, John. And I want to thank everybody who signed in from everywhere and shared their opinions, their insights, and asked a lot of great questions. Just a quick reminder, this webinar was recorded, so we'll be sending a link of the recording to your inbox shortly. So keep an eye on that. And we hope you have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.